will have the opportunity to share in our conversation. I'm Gabrielle Kaplan-Mayer. I'm the co-acting executive director of Jewish Learning Venture in Philadelphia. And one of the things that I love doing is directing our whole community inclusion initiative, which focuses on making Jewish life inclusive and accessible for children and teens with disabilities and their families. And one of my favorite parts of whole community inclusion is facilitating our consortium. We have an amazing consortium of Jewish organizations who've been working together for many years now, the Jewish Disability Inclusion Consortium of Greater Philadelphia. You can see the logos of these amazing organizations up on the screen. We meet every month and we talk about resources that we can share around disability inclusion. We collaborate, and we decided that since this year, so many of us are tuning in to speakers and to webinars, that we would do something online. And that's what created this Brunch and Belonging series. So we have it between 11 and noon. You can bring I've got my cup of tea here, coffee, take a little midday break and enjoy some conversation along with your favorite beverage or a nosh or whatever you want to have. So be comfortable, sit back. And today I am thrilled to welcome our guest, Shelly Christensen. Some of you have tuned into the webinar series that Shelly and I lead together twice a month. Everyone's welcome. So you may have gotten to know Shelly a bit. She has an incredible organization called Inclusion Innovations, and she works with faith communities, both Jewish and of different denominations across North America, and probably even more than that, Shelly. Probably you've worked with organizations internationally on making communities inclusive and accessible for people with disabilities. Shelly published an amazing resource book, I believe it was just a little over a year ago, called From Longing to Belonging. And so that's actually going to be the focus of our conversation today. This concept that we want to actually shift from thinking of inclusion of people with disabilities to the concept of belonging and what that's all about. So I'm going to turn things over to Shelly. She's going to share with us. And then I'm going to invite anyone who has a question or a comment, please share it in the chat box. And we'll have time to do some questions and comments after Shelly shares. So Shelly, I am so very happy that you're here. And we see your fabulous presentation. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gabby. One of the joys of the pandemic, well, not the pandemic itself, but how we're living our lives during the pandemic, has been the creation of an innovation of different ideas. And Gabby and I were chatting in, I think it was April, it was around Passover. And I was lamenting the fact that so many of the conferences that I usually attend have been canceled, and I wasn't going to get to see my colleagues and my friends and learn from them. And I thought, I just would love to be able to bring them out to the world and introduce them, because we are just such a collaborative world in disability inclusion and belonging. So Gabby and I came up with this idea to do a webinar series called Everyone's Welcome, a fresh conversation about disability. And we are having so much fun with this. Our 17th episode is next week. And I see so many of you here today who have been with us on this journey. And I'm just so excited to see you all. So, and I brought my coffee because nobody goes to brunch without coffee or something. So anyway, hi, thank you. I want to thank the consortium for inviting me here, and to all of you for being here. This is JDAME 2021, the 12th year we've recognized Jewish Disability Awareness, Acceptance, and Inclusion Month. And I think that, we're all immersed in different activities. And I just got an invitation from Carly Goodman this morning in Montreal to participate in or to join an activity tonight with Montreal. So there's all this collaboration, and it's just amazing. So even before we get started, this is, believe it or not, let's go to the next slide. There we go. My last name is Christensen. It is spelled this way, Christensen. I've had this name for 41 and a half years. When my husband and I were getting married, my best friend said to me, Shelly, my husband wasn't Jewish at the time. He is now, but you're going to raise Jewish children. And with the last name of Christensen, are you not thinking of this clearly? And I said, well, what would you suggest? And she said, well, just use your last name. Why don't the two of you take your last name? I said, Carla, my last name is Thomas. I don't see what difference it really makes. I mention this, by the way, this is the Jewish spelling, just so you know. I mention this because oftentimes people hear my last name and they make an assumption about me. And the assumption, and I hear this all the time, people will come up to me and say, are you Jewish? How come you talk about Judaism and, you know all this? I'm like, because I'm Jewish. And they realize that they've looked at one part of who I am, just one thing about me, my last name. Well, I'm a lot more than my last name. And each one of us here today and each person we touch in our lives are a whole lot more than the one thing we might see and the one thing we observe. And I bring this to you because when we just see one thing about a person, we make assumptions about a person. We're not going to welcome another person into our lives. There's no belonging with just one story. And this really influenced me. This is in my book. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie did a TED Talk in March of 2014. And it's a profound and kind of simple thing to understand. The talk was entitled The Danger of a Single Story. And when we look at a person, we just see that one thing about them. And of course, when we look at a person who lives with a disability or mental health condition, and perhaps it's visible or perhaps it's some knowledge that somebody laid on us about that person, that's all we see. And here is what she said. The consequence of a single story is this: it robs people of dignity, and it makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. And this really relates back to our Jewish roots, of course, to Torah. When we read in Bereshit that we are all created b'tselem Elohim, that is one of the ways we're all similar. And so that is honestly the essence of belonging. So I'm going to just go through this pretty briefly about some of the obstacles to seeing a person just as another human being, another one of God's creations. There's this thing called ableism. We have lots of isms. Ableism is discrimination or prejudice against people who live with a disability. And ableism sets this up so there's the us and there's the them being people living with disabilities and mental health conditions. So if a culture's language is full of pejorative metaphors, and I'm going to show you those in just a minute, about a group of people, that culture isn't going to see those people as fully entitled to the same inclusion as people in a more favored group. What group do you belong to? Think about that. Think about where you belong. there's a lot of still, and there will be forever, controversy about the word disability. And it's, I've been using disability to describe a disability or somebody living with a disability um, for all of my career. It was inherent in my education, my master's program, and it's just habit with me. But that said, there are euphemisms, and some of them really come from not being able to identify how a person should be called or considered, or not wanting to hurt somebody's feelings. You'll see things, I've got this list here, handy capable, and those folks, we got to get those folks in. Differently abled, physically challenged. The list goes on. And the language, and this comes from Dr. Mark Salzer, who some of you have met. He is a professor at Temple, and he does a tremendous amount of work in the field of mental health. And I called Mark when I was writing my book, and I go, do we say mental illness? What do we say? Because I didn't know. He said mental health condition, people with a mental health condition. And I really like that, because I think especially now during the pandemic, a lot of us are experiencing facets of living with a mental health condition at different times. So the most important thing is this. Language, how we refer or think about a person, can show a great deal of respect for them. There's a whole movement that says we have to use person first language, person with a disability, putting the person before the disability. And then there's the identity first movement, which says this disability is so much a part of who I am, you can't separate it. And we see that a lot in the deaf community, autistic people, and so forth. But what's most important about language is to not use it to convey pity or to think a person is a hero because they're just living their lives and they have a disability. And that's the pivot point where we reach belonging. We've done a lot of conversation in years past about inclusion, and inclusion really is a culture. It's what we do and who we are. We're inclusive. We welcome everyone. And that's a great aspiration. We're going to get to that. But the idea of belonging is where each one of us is valued and feels valued, feels that, if we're not there, if we miss a week at a synagogue, for example, our absence is noted. It's also where we as human beings can contribute our gifts, our strengths, where we find comfort in times of need. Because those are the universal things. And that's why we're talking about belonging so much more than inclusion. And honestly, what I found in all these conversations I've had with people about belonging, that is so universal. It's like everybody gets that. And I love that. Something I learned a long, long time ago, people with disabilities, mental health conditions want what everybody else wants: to work, to live wherever they want, to love, to have relationships with others, to learn. And that's lifelong learning too, by the way. To play, to socialize, to have fun, and to find a community where they feel that they belong, a place to express their spirituality or their common faith tradition with other people. And you might recognize some of the people in that picture on the bottom. I got it on a Google search, Gabby.
I love it. It's my son George's bar mitzvah 5 years ago.
And Aura. So I'm going to ask you this question, and feel free to use the chat for this. What gives you a sense of belonging in your Jewish life? What gives you a sense of belonging in your Jewish life? I know that we've done this in person. There's Natalie and Carly have been part of different programs where we've done this very activity in person. I'm just looking through. What gives you a sense of belonging? Gabby, do you want to open up the chat and see if there's any responses?
Yeah, so far I see Danielle shared acceptance no matter what. And Beth shared talking about the meaning of the Parsha for the week as a way of thinking about morals. Jenny wrote praying together. Sarah wrote Sarah Arch, I think we have a few Sarahs, having opportunities to connect with my community. Rebecca, being able to contribute as well as gain from others. Beth added Shabbat dinners, and Rebecca shared feeling part of a community, or Roberta rather wrote feeling part of a
Thank
community.
you. Thanks, Gabby.
Oh, and one more from Ina, educating others in Jewish life. And Joni shared holiday community celebrations. I think they'll keep going. Keep
I
at
think so. Go ahead and keep going. So here's the thing. If you think of a few things that give you a sense of belonging in your Jewish life, for me, I absolutely love leaning Torah. It's just, it takes me to a whole other place when I do, and I love studying Torah. I don't know what my life would be like without that. If I'd never done it before, I would long to do it. And if I'd done it before and was unable to do it, I would be bereft. And that's just one of the things in my life. And we all have those things. And so when many years ago, when I started doing my work in the field, I met a woman who wanted to join a synagogue, and she'd been living in our local area in the Twin Cities for 14 years, and she tried to join a synagogue all those times, and she kept getting, either she'd leave a message and no one would call her back, or she'd just be rejected. We don't have people like you here. And when I started working, I had a position as a coordinator of a brand new inclusion program, working with the congregations and the schools in the Jewish community here in Minneapolis. And I went to visit her, and she said, nobody Jewish has ever come to see me. I'm like, I can't imagine. But I was hearing that from her. And not only that, I was hearing some longing behind that statement. And I said to her, well, tell me what's important to you? What do you want in your Jewish life? And she said this to me, and this is almost 20 years ago. All I've ever wanted is to belong. Wow. So now let's start thinking about that sense of belonging. And let's go to the next slide. Just a reminder that a sense of belonging is the heartbeat of inclusion. They go hand in hand. So when I first started writing From Longing to Belonging, I wanted to find some text that would not only illustrate, but drive home the idea and give us all something that would help us gain a better understanding of what it means to be human, what it means to be valued. And many of you have seen this quote from the book of Isaiah: "For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples." And I thought, that's an aspiration. That's what we want to be, right? But it doesn't really say why. And I thought, I've been around this block a long time. I know what people want. People want to know why. And they want some theology behind it and text behind it. And I looked and I looked and I looked. I just couldn't find anything until one day I happened to be perusing Isaiah 56:7, and I came upon the beginning of this verse. I will bring them to my holy mount, and I will cause them to rejoice in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be acceptable upon my altar. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. That says it all. But Selam Elohim, everybody has something to contribute. As Becca said, contributing, giving back, being part of. And so this became really the decisive text that defines, for me anyway, and hopefully for you, belonging. This is just, I'm going to go through this really quickly. This is a house of prayer for all peoples. And within that house of prayer for all peoples, we need that spirit of belonging. We need that cultural shift, changing that lens to look at people not as projects, not as things that we don't have the accommodations for, or to create something for other people, or to do kind of a blanket. Well, this is for people with disabilities. We have this program for. The spirit of belonging is really based on individual relationships. And then the structure of inclusion is what we've all been doing. Those are inclusion committees and just so many of the different things that are organization based. So the spirit of belonging, actually, we could call it a process. I just call it building relationships. It's things that we do, some of us very comfortably, naturally, and others we're not as comfortable just sitting down and having a conversation with somebody. But think about this. In a conversation, it's not you, synagogue professional or community professional, facilitating a Q&A like an interview. It's an actual conversation where everybody's sharing their experiences. I love hearing people's Jewish stories or their faith stories, and sharing my own. We talk about hopes, we talk about dreams. All I've ever wanted is to belong. Okay, wow. Let's work together and understand what that means to you specifically. So I'm going to just pass this by. These are in my book, by the way, not to promote it, but structure of inclusion is where the organization assumes responsibility for internal changes through an intentional process, doing an assessment, creating an action plan, facilitating a community conversation, bringing people who are interested together to talk about where things can go in the next 6 months, and so forth. And that also includes JDAME and creating JDAME events. So I want to bring this part to you because this is, I think, after last week listening to Rabbi Darby Lee, I loved what he said. I've been thinking about this for so many years. There's JDAME, and this year is the busiest ever. And it's because of Zoom. And so many more organizations are on board. There's, I'm guessing, over 1,000 around the world. That said, I want to just put this out there that JDAME is 1 month out of 12. And it's 10 months out of a decade. And I'm not going to go any further than that. But here's the thing. If we can leverage the things that we learn through JDAME, through ideas, if you get a spark of an idea or a way to take one thing and go, I'm gonna plant this in March, and I'm gonna create, and I'm gonna work with others to take that spark of an idea and use that to educate, to change a culture, shift a paradigm, create actions. That's what JDAME really is. And that's what JDAME has always, always been. It hasn't been, here's a month, one and done. It's to raise the awareness that this is for life. It's all year and always. So just to kind of close up, and then I'm looking forward to questions, comments. We talked about everyone's welcome. Our next episode is next Tuesday, February 23rd. And we're really excited because we have people coming on to talk about advocacy and faith communities and the role of faith communities in justice and advocacy. And I think it doesn't matter. I'm giving a shout out to my Canadian friends. It doesn't matter where you live or where you're from. This is going to be really a valuable session. So we look forward to seeing you there. And you'll meet some new people too. We have some new people. Just information about my book, From Longing to Belonging, available at your local online store. And also, I just want to tell you this, it's a Kindle Unlimited book. Thanks, Natalie. From Longing to Belonging is on Kindle Unlimited. You can, if you're a subscriber to Kindle Unlimited, you can read it for free. And go for it. Go for it. And I want to end with this. We started in the beginning talking about how each one of us is created in the divine image, B'Tselem Elohim. This is a midrash from Deuteronomy Rabbah. It says a procession of angels passes before each person, and the heralds go before them saying, make way for the image of God. Make way for the image of God. And on that note, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see all of you. Hi, everyone.
First, Shelly, we got to thank you. All right, everybody, I'm leading a round of applause here. Shelly, that was really, it was such a terrific overview about, I took away, I'm focused on that image of the structure of inclusion that many of us have been working so hard putting those structures in place, overlapping and, needing that essential spirit of belonging. So I know I have some questions for you, but I want to just really encourage people. This is your opportunity. We'll hang out another 5-10 minutes. Shelly's been very generous with her time. If you have a specific question about your organization or your community and what inclusion and belonging looks like, please go ahead and put it in the chat. Shelly, I'm sorry, I cut you off.
I just wanted to say, as I mentioned, the program tonight, sponsored by our Montreal colleagues. And also it's in conjunction with the Toronto inclusion initiative as well. So across Canada, I believe. Anyway, Carly put the link in the chat. So go ahead and just click on that link, and it's going to be a great program.
Terrific. And I'll also send out, in case there are folks who are here today who haven't gotten the information about our Everyone's Welcome session that Shelly shared about, I will send that to you tomorrow when I share the recording of this session. So Shelly, I guess I wanted to just ask you, I know there may be some folks who are on the call today who, whatever their role is, may be at more of a beginning place in terms of thinking about the spirit of belonging as it relates to all people, including those with disabilities and mental health conditions. Any suggestions or thoughts about how can a community really begin to look at the structures that are needed?
I think that, first of all, listening is absolutely critical in all of this. We have to listen to each other, and we have to stop looking at another person as a problem to be solved or as somebody we can put in this particular place. That's the first thing. The second thing, and I think where JDAME is so valuable, is because it really raises the awareness, it raises consciousness, and it makes, honestly, when we started it wasn't like going, okay, this is going to be a month so that people with disabilities and their allies could feel free to come to services or be in the community. One of the things that really moved it, thank you, Ben, good idea. One of the things that really moves this forward is that people who are not necessarily or don't see themselves as affiliated or connected to somebody living with a disability or have really any awareness about disability and mental health, that they would start to see themselves, they would start to see how this impacts their organization. And so that's the work that's ongoing also. Let's just keep that going. The whole idea of keeping people updated, informed. And a lot of that, when you think about it, happens through actions. I love the idea of having speakers, having speakers come and talk kind of outside the organization a lot of times, and presenting new ideas, because sometimes that really tweaks other people's ideas. But I also think there has to be sermons. And I'd like to say we chose February because of the richness of the Torah portions, but we didn't choose it for that reason, but it's a great benefit. There's so much to talk about belonging and inclusion in the Parshiot. There, reach people in your community where they are. People go to Torah study, include a lesson on inclusion. People go to services. Kids go to religious school, day school. Bring this in as a Jewish value that everybody belongs, everybody participates. So it's really, we want to say that it's woven, and in a truly inclusive community is where belonging is woven into the fabric of that organization, that community.
Shelly, thank you. And I think we also reflect that the reason we have to bring that intentionality to it, right, is that our Jewish community, you were talking earlier about names for disability and, just sort of touching on the history, and that we're set in a society that for so long has had stigma and actual discrimination towards disability. And so in order to counter that, it requires us to be intentional.
Exactly.
And yeah, go ahead, Shelley.
I think the most important thing we can learn is just accept the fact that we all have biases, and that it's just part of being human. And from time to time, just kind of hold up a mirror and go, or a reaction to something.
Yeah.
It's, I think we saw that a lot with the death of George Floyd.
Yeah.
And we really, I think individually needed to look inside and just say, these are my biases. How do they affect my life and how I communicate with others and how I think about other people? Same with disability and mental health.
And Beth shared, yes, our organization, Jewish Learning Venture, does a lot of training with teachers, a lot of professional development. And I would say, Beth, that it's an ongoing process in terms of modeling the idea of everyone's welcome. And of course, there's so many Jewish educators out in the world that, as we shift culture and bring these opportunities to teachers, we give them tools to get to experience and model inclusion. And we have lesson plans, Shelley, on our website that I can send out to you.
Yes, day name lesson plans.
Yeah, that you can use all year round. I have a question, Shelley, and then again, if anyone else has a question or comment, please add it in. How do you think this sense of belonging and almost a year of the global pandemic has interacted? What do you think that people who may not be living with a disability or a mental health condition have learned about belonging? I know we've all had very different experiences during the pandemic, but in all the different communities you're working with, have you seen any themes emerge about takeaways from living in the pandemic?
Yes, we are more similar than we are different, for one thing. We can just point to just the vast number of people who maybe didn't participate in a religious community in person for many reasons. And accessibility is one of those, transportation, all of these things. But, and that's not just people living with disability. That said, more people have found community online. And I love the fact that so many communities, so many faith communities and disability organizations and government organizations uh, and grantees have found the means to provide access, whether it's through a drive to buy iPads and smartphones, and even buying internet access for people who aren't wired for internet or don't have it where they live, to buy, a pass so people can get online. There's just so many different ways. Is everybody reached? No. And there are certain things. A friend of mine just told me the other day that a cousin of hers died, and she has no way of mourning. She's living in an apartment, and she can connect online, but she needs to be around people. So I think that's one of the things that, again, is universal. We realize, we are part of a bigger community. So I think that in talking to a lot of different people, I think they've said that there are going to be hybrid. When we return, when we open our gates, our doors, which takes on a more meaning even now, that there are going to be hybrid ways for people to connect. I think just what we've done throughout the pandemic, we have adapted, and then we've adapted again, and we keep adapting based on the need for safety, while recognizing that all of us need our community. So
Thank you, Shelly. Um, just to kind of wrap up, I appreciate we've had some different comments and conversations here in the chat, which is great. And I want to just read out one more comment for Shelly to respond to some thoughts about, yes, exactly, Joni, that, Jewish education in general is a huge field with many people working on professional development, and the fact that many of our teachers don't have any general education, but we have been doing a whole lot to provide special education learning, which is what we've just got to keep doing. And we had a comment just that I think reflects back, Shelly, what you've been talking about in the presentation, that just like having people physically present is not the same as working to navigate what belonging means. And so why don't we throw that back to you, because I think that's a good place to close, and I think very much what you've been illustrating.
belonging isn't linear. I think we get stuck thinking either or, comparing belonging and how people belong now and how people used to belong. Keep in mind, a lot of people didn't belong in the in-person way of doing things, but now people are showing up to things they would never show up to in person. And look at every Shabbat morning, we study a Hasidic master, Sifat Emet. I'm looking at the book, the Sifat Emet. And people are coming to that Torah study, myself included, that probably wouldn't have gone in person. If it goes back to in person, I'm going because I have found a place. We find our places. So it just means that we have to acknowledge the very place we are right now, both as Jewish communities as well as individuals, and understand that there are people in the community who want what we want. And that's where this opens up. That's where this opens up. So yeah, and I appreciate all your comments. Roberta, I have a son who has Asperger's syndrome, which is a wonderful journey with him sometimes. But this is where we're at. I want to leave you with hope. Because if we don't have hope, it becomes a battle. It's so hard. But if you have hope that our communities will be places where anyone who wants to feel that beautiful, wonderful sense of belonging that we all feel in their way as they determine, that's really what keeps me doing this work, is hope. So thank you. Thanks, Gabby. Thanks, everybody. This was so fun.
Shelly, you gave us all a lot of hope. And I'll just say to all the great comments and questions that came in that this is exactly why, as Shelly said, this is a year-long conversation, a year-long communal effort. I can say that I have seen, every time a small change happens, it's the opportunity for larger changes to happen. So we have to celebrate when we see small changes happening and knowing that they're leading to larger changes. So we may not be fully there, but having these dialogues and each of us being people working towards belonging is going to have a huge ripple effect.
Absolutely. Stand on new ground. Every day is a new day. And yeah, we've all been burned before. Thanks, Joni. That's true. We've all had our things, and sometimes that makes us who we are.
Yeah.
And that's also what gives us hope.
Shelly, this was terrific. I'll be sharing out the conversation recording so you can share it. You share it with like 10 more people who should hear this today. And join us next week on Everyone's Welcome. If folks have other events that you'd like me to send out, I'm delighted to. Just email me and I'll share. And be well, take care, and thank you again. And thank you to all of our amazing Disability Inclusion Consortium of Greater Philadelphia members who have made today's program possible. Thank you all.